I went looking for a refused payment. That is the specific thing I set out to verify. A fee offered to a funeral home in Roswell, New Mexico in July of 1947 and turned down by the man who took the call. I expected paper, an offer, a figure, a refusal, filed somewhere. What I found was one sentence in a signed affidavit 44 years later, and it uses the word paid about something else entirely. So, the payment is not where this goes. What is there instead is a 4-foot casket, a question about what formaldehyde does to blood, and an Army airfield that already had a mortuary of its own and called into town anyway. I'm not making a claim here, I'm following a phone call, 2 of them, roughly an hour apart. They were placed on an ordinary afternoon, and nobody has ever explained why. His name was William Glenn Dennis, born March 24, 1925, in Abilene, Texas. In July of 1947, he was 22 years old, and he was not a mortician. He was an embalmer, 7 months out of the San Francisco College of Mortuary Science, which handed him his diploma on December 22, 1946. He had been at Ballard Funeral Home, 910 South Main Street, since he was 15. Part-time at first, still in high school. Hearing loss kept him out of the war, so he stayed, and he learned the work the slow way. And by 22, he was living in a cottage behind the building where he worked. And he held the contract. Ballard's had the military account with Roswell Army Air Field, and it covered 2 things, ambulance service and mortuary service. Dennis ran it. That made him the man the base called about caskets. Not a stranger, not a leak. The listed contact, doing the job he was under contract to do. So the call that came in that afternoon was not unusual in structure. It was unusual in content. That distinction matters more than anything else in this story, and I want it standing before we go any further. One more thing standing, because it is in the title and it is not quite right. Dennis was not dying when he told this. He told it first to a researcher named Stanton Friedman on August 5, 1989. He was 64 years old. He would live another 26 years and die in Roswell on April 28, 2015, at 90. 42 years of silence first, though. That number is the single hardest fact in his file, and I'm not going to hide it behind him. 22 years old, a man with a contract, a telephone, and no reason on earth to think the afternoon would follow him for the rest of his life. The first call came in early that afternoon, 1:15, 1:30, somewhere in that stretch of the day. The man on the other end gave a job and not a name. The base mortuary officer. He wanted to know the smallest hermetically sealed casket Ballard's kept in stock. Dennis told him 4 feet. He wanted to know how many. 2. He wanted to know how fast more could be had, and Dennis gave him the answer a man gives when he knows his own supply line by heart. Call the Texas Coffin Company in Amarillo before 3 o'clock, and Hill Truck Line puts them on the dock by 6 the next morning. The officer said he needed to know in case something came up in the future. He would call back if they were needed. That is the whole of the first call. Routine. On its face. I want to be careful about the date, because Dennis was not. In the Omni interview, he puts it on July 7th. His affidavit frames it differently. Every source that has tried to pin it lands somewhere in the first week of July, after Mac Brazel walked into Sheriff George Wilcox's office on July 6th and started the week that followed. I cannot narrow it further, and I am not going to pretend I can. Here's what does not exist. No purchase order, no invoice, no requisition, no quote, no scrap of a phone log, nothing in the military archives, and nothing at the funeral home. Ballard's files from that period were destroyed years ago. The building is still there. 910 South Main Street, still in business, opened in 1932. You can walk in tomorrow. There's nothing in it from that week. A 4-foot sealed casket is a child's casket. That is what it is for. Nobody on that phone call said the word child. 45 minutes later, maybe an hour, the officer called back. This time, he asked about preparation, specifically bodies that had been lying out in the desert for a period of time. Dennis started to answer. The officer cut across him and narrowed it, and the narrowing is the reason I'm making this video. He wanted to know what the standard chemicals would do to the body's chemical compounds, to the blood, to the tissues. Dennis told him what any embalmer would tell him. Strong solutions of formaldehyde and water mostly, and yes, it would probably change the chemical composition of the body. He offered to drive out and help. The officer declined. Future reference only. Dennis then suggested that if such a thing ever came up, he would try to pack the body in dry ice for storage and transport instead. Sit with the shape of that question. An embalmer gets asked how to make a body presentable or how to make it survive a train journey. He gets asked about odor and about time. He does not get asked what the formaldehyde will do to the tissue afterward, because for a funeral, there is no afterward. That is not a mortuary question, it is a laboratory question. I put this to a man I'll call Ostrander, who taught anatomical preparation for most of his working life, and who is a composite of the several people I spoke to, none of whom wanted a name attached. He said it plainly. In 40 years, nobody planning a burial ever asked him about chemical interference. The people who asked wanted the tissue to still mean something later. One caution. Some retellings of this call have Dennis listing sawdust and lime and aspiration. That detail is not in the affidavit. I'm setting it aside. If it was a laboratory question, it went to the wrong building. So I went looking for the refused payment. The affidavit is dated August 7th, 1991. Dennis signed it, and it runs through the calls and the base and the rest of it, and the word paid appears in it exactly once, in the last line, where he states that he was not paid or given anything of value to make the statement. Read that again. It is about the statement. It is about 1991. It is a standard closing line that researchers ask witnesses to sign, and it has nothing at all to do with July of 1947. There is no fee. Nobody offered Dennis money for the caskets or the advice, and Dennis never said anybody did. Not in the affidavit, not in Omni, not in 4 books, not in a single skeptical rebuttal written to take him apart. Both sides of this argument agree on it by saying nothing about it. The refused payment is not a suppressed detail, it is a hole. But holes have shapes, and this one has a good one, because it forces the better question. The Air Force looked at this in 1997. Their own report examined base mortuary procedure and confirmed what should have ended the story. Roswell Army Air Field had a mortuary officer. It had mortuary capability on the base. It could handle its own dead without calling anybody in town. So why call a 22-year-old embalmer at a private funeral home? Nobody has ever answered that. Not the believers, who need the call to be extraordinary and never explain the procedure. Not the Air Force, which noted the oddity and walked straight past it, and the man who made the call has no name, no rank, no unit. Dennis said outright he had no idea who it was, and 42 years of research has not produced one candidate, no fee, no name, no file. Now the part that does not hold, and I'm going to run it at full strength against him. Later the same afternoon, Dennis took a routine ambulance run out to the base with an injured airman. He said that when he pulled up at the hospital, there was debris in the back of another ambulance, pieces with markings on them he did not recognize. He said he went inside, and a nurse he knew came at him shaken and told him to get out. He said 2 men reinforced it and made it a threat, and he was escorted off the field. He said he met the nurse the next day, that she described 3 small bodies and a preliminary autopsy. Enlarged heads, slit mouths, almost no nose or ears. A smell that made people in the room sick. That she drew what she had seen on a prescription pad, and that he kept the sketches until they too were gone. Then the letter with an APO number and no return address, and his own letter to her coming back marked deceased. He gave researchers her name. Naomi Self. There is no Naomi Self in the nurse records of the 509th Bomb Group in 1947 under that spelling or any other. Confronted, he said it was a pseudonym to protect her and offered a second name, Naomi Sipes. That one produced nothing either, and he eventually conceded it was also invented. Tom Carey and Donald Schmidt built a book around this man in 2007. They were his strongest advocates. They concluded the nurse account was fabricated or borrowed from somewhere else. Carl Flock and Brian Dunning ran the harder version, and the hardest number in it is 42 years of silence. I'm not going to rescue the nurse. I'm setting her down where he left her. What stands is 2 telephone calls. 2 other men remember caskets. L.M. Hall was a motorcycle officer in Roswell in July of 1947, working the stretch of South Main between town and the field, and he was in the habit of pulling in at Ballard's for a break. He signed an affidavit describing a conversation in that driveway. Dennis mentioned a strange call from the base asking whether they had several baby caskets, and then laughed and said what they were supposedly wanted for. Understand exactly how much that is worth, because it is not much and it is not nothing. Hall's affidavit does not corroborate a crash. It does not corroborate a body. It corroborates that Dennis was telling this story in 1947 in a driveway as a joke, 42 years before there was a television audience for it. That is narrow. It is also the single most useful piece of paper in his file. 1 driveway, 1 affidavit, 1 man with no stake in any of this, signing his name 40 years later to a joke he heard once and never forgot. Garner Mason's family ran a mortuary in Hagerman, 30 miles south. His account is that it was his family's firm, not Ballard's, that actually delivered child-sized caskets to the base hospital. I expected that to cut against Dennis. It does not. Dennis never claimed he supplied anything. He always said the officer asked, said he would call back if they were needed, and then never called. If Mason is right, the order went out and went somewhere else, which is precisely the story Dennis told for 26 years. I'm not going to lean on it, though. Mason is a family recollection, a generation removed, with no delivery record behind it. It is the same kind of evidence pointing the same direction, and that is all it is. 2 men remember caskets. No paper remembers anything. The official answer is Project Mogul, and it is better than people give it credit for. The Air Force set it out in 1997, answering a congressional records review, a classified array of high-altitude balloons, modified NYU balloon trains, listening for Soviet nuclear tests. Flight 4 came down near the Foster Ranch. The bodies get attributed to anthropomorphic parachute test dummies from the 1950s and to a separate aircraft accident involving burned personnel. It explains debris nobody could identify. It explains why a press release announcing a recovered disc issued at noon on July 8th was dead by evening. Classified programs behave exactly like this. The same report acknowledged that administrative records from the field in 1947 were destroyed, and that this was consistent with what happened at installations across the country after the war. I want that carried properly. Missing paper is the most ordinary fact in this story, not the most sinister. I put the records problem to a woman I'll call Ruth, a composite of the archivists and clerks who would talk to me, 30 years inside medical filing. Names come loose from institutions for boring reasons, she said. Transfers, marriages, bad handwriting, boxes that got wet. One more name, and I'm going to handle it carefully. Miriam Bush was not a nurse. She was secretary to the chief medical officer at the field, and her family said she came home one night that July in shock. She was found dead in a San Jose motel room in December 1989, months after Dennis first spoke publicly. The finding was suicide. There were marks on her arms that got noted. I'm not suggesting a connection, I'm noting a sequence. What the record kept is an affidavit, 4 books, a magazine interview, a broadcast, and a star in a plaza. What it lost is every sheet of paper from that week, so there is no refused payment. I went looking for it and it is not there, and I'm not going to build one for you out of a sentence about 1991. Here's what I'm left with instead. A base with its own mortuary officer and its own mortuary picked up a telephone and called a 22-year-old embalmer in town to ask what formaldehyde does to blood. Nobody has ever explained why. Not the believers, not the Air Force, not Dennis, who died in Roswell without ever being asked the right question. 4 feet, sealed, 2 in stock, Amarillo by 3 o'clock, a name that was never a name. A file drawer somebody emptied, a star in a plaza for a man who told one story that holds and one that does not. He answered the phone. He answered the question. Nobody ever told him why they asked. If you enjoyed this, please leave a like and subscribe. See you in the next one.